There we go. All right, well, welcome to the Multi-Species Coronavirus Reading Group. It's a real pleasure to engage with these texts that you all have written during the pandemic. And, you know, I think they offer insight into a lot of different things. I mean, you paint a portrait of what life was like on Notre Dame campus. You're engaging with different kinds of science fiction and my own work. And really, you know, I thought maybe we'd start about talking just, you know, about lived experiences of the coronavirus pandemic. Many of you isolated, some of you got COVID. And I might just start by asking Camille, not only because you have a great vampire image that sometimes masks your face when you join these Zoom calls, but I thought you also had an interesting analysis. I mean, the blame game was something that started early in the pandemic. You know, do we think about kind of elite privilege and how, you know, early on we saw how transnational travel and certain kinds of elite networks produced global super spreader events. At the same time, we saw structurally marginalized people who might not have housing security and might have precarious jobs also, you know, played a role in spreading the virus. So do you want to say anything more about kind of how blame circulated on Notre Dame as you all tried to reckon with this moment in history?
Yeah, sure. So I feel like as like the pandemic started in March, that whole summer we saw all of the trends that you were talking about, and then coming back to campus, which didn't really feel like a choice that we had to make, but rather like an expectation that we were all to come back. It was just disappointing to see those same kind of trends continued in our academic sphere or in our like environment here, especially just with the hypocrisy of leaders and of people with larger platforms advocating for things that, in my opinion, weren't safe or that went against, you know, like CDC guidelines or just basic health precautions and having empathy for others and just like taking other people into consideration. And I couldn't help but to feel extremely frustrated last semester. So this being the first memoir that I got to write, a lot of my frustration is echoed in this, in how much disappointment I think we all felt as a student body. And despite like having some good moments, it just felt kind of saddening for senior year.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what we saw in the US in particular is just sort of nested spaces of sovereignty. Like, you know, you have certain kinds of authorities making declarations, whether it's a governor, whether it's a university president, or, you know, the president of the US or the CDC. And then you sort of had people's behavior alongside these attempts to kind of manage, you know, biopolitics, to use an idiom in the social sciences and humanities, for thinking about the politics of making some kinds of people live and letting other kinds of people die. Just in terms of the student response, I mean, it seems like there was some resistance. There were resistance in the sense of like not wanting to expose yourself to vulnerability, but also maybe were there other kinds of resistances where people were seeking out social contact? I mean, loneliness was one of the other themes in these pandemoirs. And, you know, this is not a unique or new thing in the coronavirus pandemic. You saw an earlier viral epidemic, HIV, produce similar sorts of transformations to people's behavior. And I might bring Claire into this too. So you talk about chronicles of loneliness in the pandemic and about isolating and you know, emerging after 10 days of isolation with fresh antibodies about how this, in a sense, produced a mutation in yourself. So I was wondering if you wanted to jump in and just talk about those experiences of loneliness, but also of transformation that you experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that everyone in this pandemic has had to have an obvious, very big change in their social interactions. And that, first of all, like there's all the obvious stuff of like joining Zoom calls and not going to our classes every day. But I think that when you're put in isolation and you don't see another person for X amount of days, so on campus here, whether it is you got contact traced, so you were in a hotel for 10 days, and then maybe on like day 10, you actually tested positive, so you have another 14 days, which totals up to 24 days now, which actually happened to one of my friends. That's almost a whole month that you're just alone in a hotel room. It is kind of just like crazy how I think you feel after the end of that sort of stint. And I think that when I was trying to draw the comparison to that being sort of my mutation, one, very physically, was it a mutation that suddenly I'm resistant to the coronavirus. Like I kind of felt like I had a sort of secret when I was leaving. Like I would be walking outside and I felt like, oh my gosh, like I can't get it, theoretically speaking. Like nobody knows that, but it's this kind of secret that I have in my head. And it felt sort of like a superpower, which I think is that main comparison that I tried to draw to my mutation. But at the same time, I think it also sort of changed, drawing back to that whole point of isolation, the way that I felt like I was ready to interact with people, which was definitely so strange. Like going from seeing nobody to seeing a bunch of people all the time was really exhausting and something that I wasn't prepared for. And I think I'm still struggling with preparing for as things are opening up even more. Is just kind of realizing how used to this new sort of form of social interaction I got. And I think that has also changed me very much so. And it's going to take a very long time to go back to the way things were, if I can go back to the way things were. And I think that's where I find it's sort of this mutation of the way I see myself in social interactions and environments now.
Mm. Yeah. And I imagine, coming out of isolation and you're not expected to abide by the same norms as everybody else when everyone else was still expected to isolate, still, mask up. Like, how did that feel moving through social worlds where, I mean, I would imagine some people would, not knowing kind of the particularities of your experience, would be like shaming you or going back to the blame thing. Like how did that play out in both during the isolation and afterwards?
Right. Yeah. I definitely, like, I would always wearing a mask and everything and, social distancing, because there was that fear of like people thinking that I wasn't being COVID safe or something. And even then it would be like if I was hanging out with one other friend and we were kind of like, we don't have to wear masks, we don't think, because I can't carry anything and give it to you, but also like, heaven forbid I actually did. And it was still just kind of like having to sort of tiptoe around that. But so I guess my point is that I still and my friends who got it with me, we would still try and adhere to all these protocols. There's just some of it felt a little arbitrary at some point. Like I'm doing these things less because I think they're actually doing things, but more because it's just this social expectation now that blame, as Camille was saying, is such this kind of strong part of, I think, my junior year of college.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, you talked about how the pandemic has left many people feeling alienated from society in general, similar to what we were just hearing about from an individual perspective, and you're thinking about this in broad terms about how socialization, being social with people is where morals and ethics are formed. Kind of panning out from individual experiences. how do you think this is shaping your generation of fellow students at Notre Dame, but also maybe people younger than you?
Yeah, so I think what really shaped my pandemic was when I went back home over break. I saw how affected some of my close friends were. So some of my friends who didn't go to college because of the pandemic, the only interaction they really had for the whole time was with their family. And so a lot of my friends who were really previously social, when I went back over break to visit them, they were a lot more closed off, and some of my friends expressed like social anxiety that they had never experienced before. And while there were opportunities for them to reach out to individuals who were going to the same colleges who were locally, and while they could socially distance and meet, they chose not to just because they developed this social anxiety and they were really only used to seeing their family. And it was kind of shocking for me to come back because I hadn't really stayed in contact with my friends while I was in college because I was busy as a freshman, adjusting to everything. And so it's kind of shocking to come back and see how much the pandemic and social distancing had affected them. And I think the long period of time we had separated made that difference a lot more apparent. And aside from just people in my age group, I know my friend was expressing concern for her little brother because he seemed to just not want to meet people. And especially at like a young age, I feel like you kind of determine a lot of what's normal. And when you go a whole year and what's normal is staying in your room and like coding or playing video games and not going outside or interacting with people, I feel like it starts to become a habit. And I was worried about even after the pandemic, if those would linger, since we know like what's normal, but at that age, you're not really sure what is quite normal. So I think those are like the main concerns that I'd written about, and like how those effects, how long they would last, and like whether they would actually be have meaningful effects in the future.
Yeah, shifting norms, I think, is one really profound thing that has happened during the pandemic. And sometimes it's mundane. So, Dominic, you mentioned that no one allowed you to wash your laundry one weekend. That's a basic social norm that we're taught from being little kids. You're supposed to take a shower every day. You're supposed to wash your clothes. Like, how did that? There's these competing norms, right? You have to protect yourself, protect society by isolating, but you can't do this other basic thing that you're also expected to do. What was that experience like?
It was very surreal getting that random call that I was going into isolation or going into quarantine because of close contact trace. But what was most surprising was I just wasn't prepared for all the sort of strange social interactions that would come with going into that quarantine, because it seemed like a lot of things weren't fully, it felt like no one really knew what to do. And so following the sort of protocols to whatever extent they could was just what was starting to develop. And then as time went on, certain other things developed, right? And so I remember being in the room across from the hotel laundry room, but not being able to wash my laundry because I wasn't allowed out of my room. And just having to go through phone call after phone call with the care and concern team just to see what the proper way for someone to get my laundry was, which required the bag to be dropped off and then picked up the next morning. And another interesting interaction I remember writing about was being asked whether I wanted to be close contact traced by the person that I had been exposed to. This sort of politeness that was, I suppose, expected by some people. was something that had
I mean,
developed
I'm
among
not,
some
I'm not
faculty.
familiar with like how it was playing out there. So what does that mean to be, you ask, you have to grant permission before?
Well, one of my friends had realized that he had tested positive, and then so the typical procedure is that that person is asked confidentially who they had been in close contact with, and then those people are contacted separately by the coronavirus tracing unit at Notre Dame. But something that I suppose developed is that since friend groups usually knew which people were going into isolation, it was usually we would be contact tracing within our friend groups, I suppose, to a degree as well. And so people were open about who was in isolation, but something developed, I suppose, that would be that you would contact the people you were physically near, that you had possibly exposed, and then ask them whether they wanted to be placed in a quarantine, which I thought was ridiculous, because it shouldn't matter what the person thinks. If you're going to protect the community, everyone should be placed into the quarantine facility regardless of thoughts. And so I thought that was interesting.
So there was sort of different standards that emerged in some of these closed networks, and I would imagine that it was contested too. I mean, did it feel like, because I would imagine just the scale and the scope of the infections. I mean, did any of this feel futile in the sense of like, we're doing all this hard social isolation, but even as we try our best, it might not be able to respond to the enormity of the moment.
I know that was felt by several people, and feeling that way then led to sort of go-arounds in some of the protocol, which further exacerbated. And when the protocol wasn't followed, it further exacerbated the problem. And so sometimes containment was difficult.
And you also talk about the experience of anger. So can you recreate that moment during the Zoom get together? I have to sit there seething in my anger as he explains how bad isolation is.
Right.
You're waiting for your test.
Yeah. So I was trying to compare myself to a little bit of Frankenstein's monster, as he and Dr. Frankenstein both seem to have these competitions of who seems to be suffering more because of the other one. There was one of the, there are a lot of, I think we've talked a lot about the loneliness and a lot of the problems that we as social animals experience going into isolation. And a lot of people, there were a lot of people that are very, they have a lot of respect for that, and they take it into account. But one of the interesting things was just that it seemed that on our Zoom get together of all of us that were together in quarantine, there was a sharing of grievances, almost to the level of contention of who was having a rougher time. And I just found it frustrating that being placed in a quarantine myself, because the person who infected me had opted out of being placed after he had been asked that question of, do you want to be contact traced? I felt a little upset at that, a little bit of, I guess, feeling that blameworthiness towards someone else, at least the emotional desire to place it.
Yeah. So John, you talked about your experience reading about, Victor Frankenstein, this crazy ambitious guy, at a moment where you didn't feel that ambition, that you were kind of out of sync with norms and expectations. And I imagine admitting that, that's a big deal. You saw pandemic overachievers be celebrated in various forums. So do you want to open that up and talk about what it was like being isolated and alone in a context where you're expected to, be reading, thinking, producing, doing all the things that, in normal times would be expected and demanded.
Yeah, I think it was such a unique situation where I was at the point in the semester where I had just such a burden from like all of my classes. And so I was at the point where I wanted this like just time to myself, like no social requirements. I didn't have to go hang out with people or see people, and I could just be alone to focus on my work. And I was actually at the point where I felt like I had no ambition to do the work because I was just so isolated from everything that I just couldn't put time towards anything. And so it was very nerve-wracking because I was even, when I got put into isolation, I thought I only had strep throat because that's what I tested positive for. And then I soon realized that I would be in isolation for another 10 days. And so I don't know, it's just weird seeing all of these stories of people that were so ambitious, but I think at the same time, people that had the opportunity to achieve so much in isolation, they still had the ability to go out and go for walks. It's so weird to think that after 10 days, I would be so grateful just to be outside and to have fresh air to myself, just because isolation took so much of that away that I was looking at the same four walls every day and thinking, okay, what should I do next? And so I feel like that led to most of my lack of ambition, was just being in the same environment in the same way for so long that it just like drains you of anything that you want to do.
Yeah. So we were talking about norms and normality a little bit ago in the context of, laundry and hygiene expectations, but there's a lot of norms right now that are either getting remade or actively contested. And is the phrase COVID normal, is that at play in South Bend too? Because it is here. Is that what the administrators talk about, or is it a different idiom there?
Haven't they used the new normal a lot? Isn't that something they've talked a lot about, new normal? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's slightly different. So there is kind of a sense, I mean, here, there's kind of a desire, almost a nostalgia for life as it was, not an imagining about life as it might be. And I think, it's an opportunity to really reflect. There's the phrase anthropause that some biologists have used to think about, at least in an environmental sense, about some of the positive benefits that emerged at a moment when carbon emissions were reduced, at a moment when humans were less active outside, which meant that other kinds of life could flourish. So I'd be interested, just like from these lived experiences of norms getting actively remade, like does anyone emerge from this in this new normal? Like what are the norms that you want to contest moving forward? What are the things that you would like to see changed about society, about modes of sociality, about these broader societal norms that we live with and sort of govern how we move through the world? This is a broad question. I think it's maybe addressed to everybody, if anyone feels compelled to respond.
Go ahead, Irene.
Just one of the norms that I think that should have been always implemented is that when someone is sick, they don't have to show up for work or school. Like I remember in high school, like when I was sick, it was a point of pride for me and my friends being like, oh, I went to school and my mom made me go to school even though I'm like have a fever and stuff. It's like, no, that shouldn't be a thing because you're putting other people in danger. You have like, before we didn't have COVID, but we still have a lot of like viruses that do impact people's health, and we shouldn't be around spreading that or expected to complete our like productivity rate while being sick. So I think that should be still be a thing moving forward, that when like someone is sick, we just like believe them and not expect them like show up to school or like work, because it's not just like for your own well-being, but it's for everyone else's well-being. Like it's even counterproductive because other people get sick and they can't work, and so it's like it reduces the efficiency one way or the other.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think another thing that has come up during the pandemic is just increased awareness for mental health. And I think that's a huge thing that going forward needs to be in the public eye more and more, is just people struggling, especially during the pandemic, just the isolation and how much that has challenged people's mental health. But going forward, I think it's one thing that should be constantly brought up, is just how can we help others and go out of our way to help someone that may feel isolated in a way, mentally or physically. And so I think I've heard so much in the past year just about how we can be there for others and the challenges they may go through mentally. And so I feel like that should be a constant consideration.
Back on what you were saying, Irene, it's a little known biographical fact about Albert Einstein. He basically came up with the theory of relativity while living in a tiny little room, basically bedridden from an extended illness. And, you know, this also relates, I think, to John's, you know, the pandemware that you submitted and wrote. You know, this feeling of a need to be productive or produce. You know, in an academic world, having a moment to pause, or a long extended period to pause and think. You know, thinking isn't necessarily something that you're doing when you're sitting down to your computer, or, you know, actively engaged in a particular activity. You could be bedridden, you could be canoeing, you could be doing anything. So yeah, I think maybe stepping back from, you know, what counts as an achievement, what counts as productivity, could be another thing to think about, another thing to draw from this collective lived experience. I'm looking at some of the essays, but I think some, like is Colin here? I don't see Colin, but I'll just say, you know, in thinking about the power of technology in a pandemic world, the specifics of CRISPR, you know, I think we were at a moment where we saw just the failings of modern science and technology for many months. You know, now we have vaccines, a whole slew of vaccines, but I think it's important to remember what it was like in March, April, May of last year, when getting masks was so difficult, much less getting a test. And, you know, as the scientific project caught up with all of this, I think, you know, we could see a narrative reasserting itself about the technological mastery, the modern world's ability to sort of control and understand. But there was a long moment there where the power of technology kind of, you know, had some serious gaps in it. So I think that's an important lesson to bring forward. I don't think the lesson is like, okay, you know, we were in a hard spot and modern science responded and now problem solved. As we see, you know, a vaccine might not be an easy solution to the end. You know, it's not like, okay, we've reached a certain level and now it's a complete return to life as it was before. Like something profound has shifted. And I think we're still just starting to grapple with what has shifted collectively. There was also one at the end that I learned the new Marvel comic book character. Let's see. So Bucky Barnes, this is in Anousha's, and I don't think Anousha's with us either, but it was interesting to hear.
Anousha is here.
Oh, Anousha is here. All right, Anousha, hey. Tell us about Bucky Barnes and, Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you picked up on the military applications of CRISPR. This is a part of gene editing that's being actively pursued by a number of different governments. Since I published the book, the book describes Pentagon programs, $100 million being invested in military applications of this. China's working on some things. I was told that if Dr. He had done his experiment in one of the military labs, that the same sort of controversy wouldn't have emerged, and the government would have been behind him 100%. They are still, going ahead with gene editing experiments. So tell us about Bucky Barnes and what kinds of lessons we might draw from this this character.
Yeah, so I ended up watching a lot of Marvel movies over quarantine, so that was like a big part of it. And so when I read your book and like the other things we've read about gene editing, they immediately came to mind. And so it's like a lot of people have heard of Captain America, but then Bucky's kind of like the opposite of it, where it's like he wasn't a willing participant in the gene editing. So like this was done to him while he was unconscious, and he became like a weapon for them, and he has no control over it. So it is kind of like, in my mind, it was kind of like what they did to the babies, because there is like they don't have an opinion in it. And then it also like determined his future, and there was no way he could undo it. And also, like, I know the experiments that we read about weren't necessarily a military application, but I could very easily see it being translated there, because like if we're starting at HIV, who knows what other genes we could start to target and modify. And just like, would it have to be the norm where like all countries modify their soldiers to have like a chance at fighting and things like that? And then it's like, where do you stop gene editing, and where do people like not become people and just become like straight up weapons? And that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, so maybe for starters, I'll just like kind of go down that rabbit hole for a second. One gene that you could take out relates to the sensation of pain. That would be a relatively easy, like with existing technologies, at the single cell stage, it would be relatively easy to delete that gene, to disable it, to do a targeted mutation that makes it not function. There's a lot of benefits that you might see as if you were a general commanding soldiers to have people not feel pain. But there's serious risks. So many children who don't have that gene end up biting off their tongues, or otherwise harming themselves, like leaving your hand on the stove and not realizing that you're hurting yourself. And I think, with all these genes that you could imagine as targets for military or athletic enhancement, it's all like pretty serious trade-offs. So you could also target EPO, a gene that would basically enhance endurance. And there's a skier from Finland who naturally, like spontaneously developed this mutation, and members of his family also have it. And he was a great athlete in terms of his endurance, but the family also had to give blood regularly to prevent strokes from happening. You could look at myostatin. There's a part of the book where I describe this child who has massive muscles at the age of 5, who looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger as a little kid. And you could easily target that gene with CRISPR, and that produces a serious effect. But also people and animals with this mutation have smaller organs and are more prone to heart attacks. So I think if you kind of look at the history of experimentation on soldiers, if you look at the history of athletes who compete with each other in these high stakes events, you see all kinds of things that have been done that give people advantage on the battlefield, or give people advantage at the Olympics or other competitions, but that have serious health consequences for either the soldiers or the athletes. So, I think we're in a moment where civilian leaders haven't stepped in and come up with a legislative framework to protect soldiers, to protect athletes. The Olympics has a broad rule saying you can't, it's called gene doping, you can't do this, but if you talk to a geneticist, it's very difficult to detect. It's very difficult to detect when this has been done. And you could imagine doing it in adults as well. So the book talks about how the HIV community, adults had their blood cells taken out, different cell types were separated. Some of those cells were billions of those cells were edited and then put back. You could imagine that same sort of thing being done with EPO, for example, the one that's related to oxygen transport. So yeah, completely plausible and actively emerging in reality. Thinking about this during the pandemic, how do these science fiction futures help you understand kind of the lived experience of what you went through during the pandemic, Anousha?
I think it's definitely just made me see like what more is possible and how these aren't quite as unrealistic as I thought in the past. Just especially seeing like all the technology that we do have available and like the speed that we can develop things scientifically if we need to. Because I never knew that like a vaccine could be developed and distributed this quickly. So like the positive aspects of science, but then also just like I didn't realize a pandemic could spread this quickly or this easily. And so I always thought like those types of pandemic apocalypses were completely unrealistic. But this did make me realize that like if COVID had had a higher death rate, like that would have been very plausible. And it's just like there's not much we could really do to stop it, especially with just like how interconnected all travel and trade is. Like society would shut down because there's no real way to isolate all the different communities. So it's like we wouldn't be able to do anything.
The part of the character that I found interesting that you introduced us to, Bucky Barnes, is just the lack of consent. And now we're at a moment where it's a new experimental moment with the widespread distribution of vaccines under emergency use authorization. And this has led to the proliferation of stories. And some of those stories are grounded in biologically accepted normative discourse, stories about risk, stories about benefits. But then there's other stories about, Bill Gates wanting to insert microchips in all of us. But these stories have profound consequences in terms of how people approach the vaccines. And I was wondering if you are interested at all or tracking, or if anybody is tracking the ways that we've seen a proliferation of stories and what gets to count, as you're reading these science fiction texts in the pandemic, how do you make sense of the pandemic stories that are maybe not using the same standards of facts, of normative discourse that prevail in a university? Has anyone come across these stories? I mean, I'm sure everybody's come across these stories, but does anyone have a particularly interesting story to report, or any like reflections on what these stories are doing, either within your social worlds, within your social media spheres? Because I think we're at a moment in a time of isolation, in a time of great anxiety, a time of great fear, when there's really a proliferation of storytelling, and those stories have consequences. Zach?
I think I can definitely talk on that topic. I'm from China. I'm still in China. And so when COVID-19 broke out here in around January 2020, there was one writer created this huge piece of work called like Fan's Diary. Fan was her name. And it was marked anti-government, anti-communism, and completely banned. You cannot find it anywhere. And when you do find it, it's posted as like it's ridiculed and posted as the how should I put it? Like everybody is criticizing it. I did look at the original text. It's kind of there was no scientific supporting of all her claims and assertions, and it was indeed a lot of emotions surrounding like the whistleblowers that and attacking the Chinese officials, saying they concealed facts and secretly buried bodies. And the reason why so many people don't believe her is because like nobody ever see the burying sites or anything related. So I look at COVID also as a blame game, but it has a lot of political significance in how rivaling countries use this as an excuse to attack one another. And another thing relating to that is even the vaccination itself has a political meaning. I'm getting my U.S. visa. I'm about to arrive at the States in late July, and one very serious problem in front of me is which vaccine am I going to take? If I take the Chinese vaccine, I'm not going to will not be able to take it 12 months after I arrive at Notre Dame, which make me very vulnerable to potential mutations of the viruses, anything coming up. But if I choose not to take it here at home, it will make my traveling very dangerous. And so as an international student, I personally feel the conflict between this U.S.-Sino tension is having a huge impact, and how COVID has left its track as a disease, as a pandemic, and put more focus on the political arena.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of interesting things happening. So we see the WHO approving Sinovac in the last few days. We see origin stories unraveling about the Wuhan wet market. This virus quite likely was circulating throughout Asia, possibly even throughout Europe before it was detected by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We're still writing the stories of the pandemic, and the facts are still kind of up for grabs and settling. But yeah, I think the role of China as a place, and in the book I was trying to grapple with the sort of Sino-futurism, to use a term from my friend Bodhi Chakravarti, who runs the Co-Futures Project in Oslo. He's interested in Afrofuturism, Sino-futurism, Latin American sci-fi futures. And here with the pandemic, you both saw a technological response from China in terms of the genomic science, in terms of the ability to test, the ability to isolate, that was much more better coordinated and prepared and advanced than what you saw in the US. So the dream of Xi Jinping of the China dream, an Asian future that's disruptive of Western modernity, in some ways it's arriving, and it's sitting uneasily with stories about sort of the technological mastery and unimpeded progress of Western modernity. One of the things you mentioned was mutants that escape the vaccine, and this was what Ashley was talking about in her pandemoir. Ashley, do you want to jump in here and sort of unravel some of the things that you were thinking about escape variants, but also back on the subject of kind of the human as a mutating subject, as a subject that's changing genetically, but also we might think about mutation in a broader sense as we become adapted through these various technological means.
Yeah, so in my memoir, I just wanted to connect like genetics and like how like CRISPR, it connects to like Dracula and Frankenstein, because I thought that like inserting mutations was similar to how like Dracula would infect his like the people that he went after. So that's kind of how I related those two together. So yeah.
And what about these mutant varieties? I mean, much has been made of mutations in the popular press lately. You know, really, I think in the last 5 to 6 months, we've seen popular discourse about mutants really reemerge, and you know, there's a fear of the mutants. I think a lot of it, if you kind of follow the primary virology, a lot of the virologists were less concerned than the public health officials, at least from some of these early reports of variants from the UK and elsewhere. But now we're starting to see concern within the virology community about these mutants that might escape the protections of a particular vaccine. So as we're living with mutating viruses, what sorts of transformations do you think need to happen to reckon with these dynamic life forms?
So in like the COVID vaccine, a specific article came out to caught my attention, which is why I wrote about it in my pinned memoir. And it was how mutants are arising in COVID because of the vaccine and because of the antibodies that we're putting in. So that was like concerning for me, because I'm like wondering, oh, imagine putting all these, like doing all these vaccinations, and even for like tuberculosis, that vaccinations could cause mutants in like existing conditions. And I was thinking, if like mutations seem to pop up, then it's harder to fix those mutations, because like bacteria becomes like antibiotic resistant to those. So that's just like what I was thinking. And like as scientists, you can fix that by trying, like predicting what kind of mutations will arise. And it's really hard to do that, obviously, but maybe like in the future we can use like biotechnology to try to predict what type of mutations might arise.
Yeah, there's a really great article by Hannah Landecker that talks about not the history of biology, but the biology of history, how biological organisms, in this case, microbes that resist antibiotics, respond to the contingencies of human history and intervention. And I think we'll start to see the same sorts of things being done with these different lineages and strains. It turns out that within a given individual, so you know, a test is looking at a small, you know, most of the PCR tests are an antibody test. A PCR test is looking at a small snippet of the genome. Antibody test is just looking at some of the surface proteins. But as we do whole genome sequencing, that's when we can see these variants. And it turns out that you know, even within a single person's body, you're likely to see multiple variants, multiple mutations. So as you were just saying, you know, the potential to escape, especially, you know, if a single vaccine is used on a population scale, the ability of the virus to escape becomes a lot bigger. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I haven't asked questions of everybody, but does anyone else want to jump in here? I think among the people I haven't asked questions of are Sara, I think Megan, Thomas. I don't think Brian has spoken up yet. There's a number of you. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to jump in, any reflections on, you know, what we've been talking about relating to these pandemics, these shifting norms, these mutating forms of life, these emergent forms of biotech?
I think Sara had an interesting argument about Dracula and mutations and vaccines that that might be relevant.
Yeah, that was for my second pandemoir. I made the argument that how Dracula is presented in Bram Stoker's novel is quite similar to the way that we've interacted with the virus itself, seeing how there's an origin in the bat genome in the wet market in Wuhan, and how Dracula is often depicted as a bat coming to prey on Mina and Lucy, and seeing that in both cases with the pandemic and the situation as it comes about in the novel, it's both the result of humans making mistakes in our protocols and how we deal with emergencies, and how looking at the timeline of how the emergency was declared in China in early February, and how much travel still was allowed to happen after there was a state of emergency declared. That was a huge oversight in how we were unable to take control early on. And similarly in the In the book, we have a lot of characters who don't understand the threat as it is surfacing, and therefore let it get out of hand before they can really, when it was in the situation where they could have stopped it. And so it's interesting to see how both of these show a man-made interaction with nature takes a horrible spin for the worse when we're unable to control our own actions.
Sounds super interesting. As a matter of fact, the bat stories have started to unravel a little bit over the last year. So if you look at our rat tag, RITG, I think is the bat coronavirus that is still the virus that's most similar to SARS-CoV-2 from genomic analysis. If you look at the microbial clock, like the amount of mutations that have accumulated over time, the most recent common ancestor is estimated to be somewhere between like 1945 and 1981. So there's a big gap in our narratives. And you know, some bat coronavirus specialists insist like, yeah, we need to keep looking at bats, but other conservation biologists are looking at ways that bats have become sort of blamed for the failings of you know, human biosecurity protocol, the excess of industrial practices, agriculture, other sources that might be involved. My money is actually on cats rather than bats, at least as, you know, it turns out that cats get SARS-CoV-2, all manner of cats, you know, lions were just found with it, but domestic cats. And, you know, we don't interact with bats that much. So some people are specializing on, you know, studying human bat interactions in the context of SARS-CoV-2 transmission. But we interact with cats an awful lot. So, you know, the jury is still out, but, you know, I think that your story sounds remarkable, and I would love to see that one too. So we've got 2 minutes. Does anyone else want to jump in and have the final word? Eileen, do you want to have the final word?
Oh, well, this has been a joy to hear everyone chip in and reflect back on what a year we've had. It's been an epic year. You know, I think I've only recently come to terms with the fact that for all intents and purposes, it's over for me. I've been vaccinated. I'm one of the very privileged people in this world who has been fully vaccinated. And actually, at Notre Dame, I think there has been a silver lining to this year. We had a difficult year in many ways, with about 30% of the student population, I believe, infected with COVID over the course of the year, which is a very high percentage. So it was a tough year for us. But on the other hand, now not over 90% of people on our campus are vaccinated. And we had 0 cases today on our dashboard, which means vaccination can work when it's done in a community systematically. And so we did accomplish that as a community. And I'm very proud to be part of a community that managed to accomplish something so powerful and important in the midst of such trial. And my students helped me do it. I'm so grateful to my students for soldiering through this year, especially those who took the whole year-long Honors Humanities seminar and wrote memoirs all year. It took a lot of courage to do that and to publish them online and to discuss them here today. And I'm very grateful to my my new seminar this semester, a very small group, but I had very memorable conversations. I feel like both of these classes were more like book clubs than seminars. And I learned a lot from discussion of some very challenging and difficult novels with a lot of really touchy, sensitive, painful material. I mean, it is Gothic literature after all, and takes a lot of courage to talk about some of the darker themes in the novels we read. So I'm very grateful to my students for soldiering through that too with me and putting up with my obsession with monsters of the 19th century. So just a big thank you, and a big thank you to Eben for organizing this. This was such an honor to be able to share our written work, our memoirs, with the broader anthropological community studying the coronavirus and its impact on multiple species around the world. It really gave the memoirs some gravitas. So thank you. I feel like we actually accomplished something from a literary perspective, that may actually resonate with anthropology. I really appreciated how you ran today's session like an interview. I could see your anthropological training coming through, and that really made me realize that the purpose of writing a personal essay is to share one's experience of one's culture and society with others, and that's what we accomplished through this session. So
yeah, so and thank you, Eileen, for sharing this, and thank you to each of you for, these are all, such important texts, and it takes a lot to be able to, put your thoughts and feelings, and these are really intimate moments that you've shared with the world. And, thank you for letting me be part of this moment and visit the class earlier. I think, this moment, I think in many ways marks an ending. It also might mark a beginning. But, I think collectively you've lived through a moment that we'll be talking about for decades, centuries to come even. And texts like this are part of the historical record now. They're part of what future generations will turn back to make sense of reality as it was and as it might be. So thank you for engaging with all of these smart ideas and for sharing your experiences, which are so rich and so important. So thanks for coming. You're welcome back in the reading group anytime. We meet every week. It's a different time to accommodate the speakers in different time zones, but we've got virologists, we've got some science fiction authors coming up, some Chinese science fiction authors actually. Stanley, I'm going to butcher his last name, Quifan, I believe, who's written Waste Tide and is sharing a piece about mediated techno-death, and Ancestor Temple in the Box is the short story he's sharing with us. But we've also got some virologists, some epidemiologists, some anthropologists. So, feel free to come back anytime. So great to see you all again. And yeah, hope to see you in real life someday.
That's right. Yay.
Bye, thanks.